Hello guys. So anyways, we're going to just be talking. We're going to have a little chat. You're definitely going to want to take notes. I do have some very structured points, so this will be super easy to take notes about. But this whole topic is about effective communication when you're talking to your spouse or wanting to have a conversation with your spouse about something that's maybe a little more difficult. So this is things like finances, bank accounts, big purchases. All those kind of fall under the financial category, but this could also be things like maybe having hard conversations with your kids, whether that's just like about puberty, growing up, sex. I'm trying to think, like, there's lots of things that could be. This could be things related to maybe how you parent or how you handle certain situations in your house. Like maybe you guys don't agree on how specific things are supposed to work or function or be structured. And so it could be one of those conversations. So whatever the case, we're going to talk about how you can go about having effective communication when you're going into those situations. So my first point here is to start with a prayerful heart, not trying to prove a point. And so this means that before you go into this hard conversation, right, you're going to want to, before ever speaking, make sure that you're taking a quiet moment with God. So this might seem like common sense, but I know for me, like, I skip this step a lot, and I think, oh, I don't need to do that, and it gets to the point where, like, it never gets to be habit because I don't do it consistently enough. So the key here is to consistently go to the Lord before we have these hard conversations and not to have them on the fly. And that means you're going to have self-control. If you're in a moment and then, like, say you're in that moment, the thought comes to mind of like, oh, well, I should bring this up to my spouse right now. Or they say something that like triggers you to think about that thing that you want to have the conversation with. Like, that takes self-control to not go into the conversation right then and to say, like, to note to yourself, like, hey, I want to come back to this later. So we're going to start with prayer. We're going to invite the Holy Spirit into this. So that could be like praying something like, Lord, help me to seek peace and not victory. Show me what I'm not seeing here. And then maybe reading a scripture to go with that, like Psalms 139, verse 23. Maybe, and even like basing your prayers off those scriptures, right? If you have one that like really jumps out to you. And then the second point under this would be to examine your own heart. So asking God to reveal any bitterness, any pride or harshness that might be coming up for you that could potentially sabotage the conversation. And then the third point under this would be to lay down expectations. So that means surrendering the urge to control your husband's reaction and anchoring yourself in obedience, not outcome. And what that practically looks like is taking a deep breath, closing your eyes, and imagining yourself holding the stress of these expectations you have for your husband, the expectations you have for the conversation, the pressure that you're putting on yourself, the pressure you're putting on him, the big emotions, all of the things, holding them in your hand and imagining yourself just literally lifting them up to God and him just whisking them out of your hands. And for you, it's like they're this, 200-pound weight, and to him it's like, this is nothing. It is a crumb, if even, that he just picked up off your hand, right? Like, imagining that actually will give you peace to just do that mentally. And it can seem silly if you've never done something like that before, but the reason that it works is because our brain doesn't know difference. It doesn't know reality from not reality. So when we're imagining something in a picturesque way in our mind or playing out a scenario, our brain can sometimes be tricked into thinking it's true. It often is. And so that's why when you imagine negative things happening, you feel a very real, a negative emotion, and your body can go into a very real fight or flight response, even if there was no danger around you in reality. So let's use that tool that we often use for evil for good, right? Let's use it for good to help us in this situation. So, and this also means that you just have to tell yourself that you're going to be okay with the outcome no matter what happens with this conversation. You're not going into it to try to manipulate the situation right? Like, obviously we all have desires of outcomes we want, especially like if we go in with a specific point, there usually is a goal of the conversation. It's okay to have a goal, but we cannot be so held so tightly to that goal that we are like going to let anything short of that goal mean that we failed, right? Like, we can't make not meeting that goal mean something really horrible, okay? Hopefully that makes sense. Just go in with this loose kind of light expectation that no matter what happens in the conversation, God can use it for your good and he can use it for his glory, and it could be a stepping stone. It doesn't have to be the one and only conversation that you ever have, right? Like, I know I'm so tempted to get into these mindsets where I think like, oh my gosh, it's gonna be the only time that we ever have to have a serious conversation, but we don't have to make it mean that. Even if it's true that we hardly ever have hard, serious conversations, or we hardly ever have time alone to have those conversations, even if that's true, we can still look at it like, okay, this is just a stepping stone. This is one part of us stepping into a season of our lives where we're going to communicate more clearly and more calmly about these things more often. So try to look at it that way and look at like, okay, we made progress. Even if it didn't feel like progress, we can still choose to find some way, right? And we do that by asking ourselves, like, how was progress made in this conversation? And then do not let yourself say, I don't know. Do not let yourself choose not to answer. Like, sit there until you come up with at least one little thing that can mean that you made progress with that conversation. So trust me, your brain will find a way. It will when you ask it a question and you force it to answer. Okay. Point number 2 here is to use gentle honesty instead of accusations. So the point of being a biblical wife, a submissive wife, a wife who is walking in the Spirit, walking with the fruits of the Spirit, the point of that is not to just never speak your mind. It's not to not be honest. It's not to only say nice things. The point is that when we do need to be honest, we do need to share something that might be hard to share or might be hard for the other person to hear, that we do that from a gentle and kind place. We do it out of love. I'm going to lift this up a little bit and just, okay. So, some examples of this actually there's 3 points under every point I'm going to share. So just so you know that as you're structuring your notes. So before I dive into the first sub-point, this is about setting a tone that will open your husband's ears to hear you, instead of him being triggered by, the first couple things that you say, and then he shuts down, he gets defensive, and he's not willing to hear the rest. So one way we can do this is to speak from I, not from you. So I have been feeling overwhelmed lately, and I need support. And you'll notice that there was no blaming in that, right? So it wasn't like, I'm feeling overwhelmed because you're failing at blah, 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 right? And it doesn't mean that we can never tell our husbands when we feel like they're not meeting a need, but you do have to know how to say that in a way that is, one, not going to feel like an attack to them, and two, not going to feel like you're blaming them for everything, right? Because even if it's true that they're falling below your expectations in some way, it doesn't mean that they're responsible for X, Y, and Z, like all the results of that. They are just responsible for the one part that maybe like they didn't do. Like, you asked them to do something, they didn't do it. And sometimes it is just that they weren't aware of the expectations as well. So like, we just have to go in with a lot of grace and a lot of open-mindedness, because we could think that we know what's going on, but they could have a whole nother perspective. So start with just speaking about yourself. What is going on with you? What are you feeling? You can go into a little bit of why you think you're feeling that. But if that's going to lead you into a whole line of like bashing, or if that's going to fuel some emotion of anger or resentment, then let's just stay away from that. We don't even need to discuss why right now. We can just discuss what we need to do to support you moving forward. So like in this example, I've been feeling overwhelmed lately and I need support. It doesn't explain why she's been feeling overwhelmed. It just says, I need support from you. And then you could go into what that support looks like, or what you need this change to look like. What, like, maybe that is, I've been feeling overwhelmed and I need support from you. I really need blank. Like, I really need us to look at our finances together and get on the same page about this. We need financial intimacy. We need to be doing the finances together. We need to be making these decisions together. We need a joint account. We need, let's another example. I'm stressed out about, thinking about this conversation we need to have with the kids. I need you and me to be on the same page about it. I was hoping that you would be willing to discuss it with me so that we can come to a conclusion together and have a plan for when, where, how we're going to tell the kids and what that's going to look like between you and me and between us and the kids. Those are just a couple examples. And then the next sub point here is to describe, not diagnose. So address behaviors, not character. So this is in the case that you do need to address something that they've been doing that has been hurting you in some way. So what I mean when I say address behaviors and not character is that we want to be very, very specific about what is happening that is bothering you. And we want to not use words that would bash our husband's character. For example, like selfish, narcissistic, swearing, right? Like calling them an a-hole or like all those sorts of things, right? And I have been there. I've been the wife who does those things. I'm still getting to the point where I have to force that not to be automatic for me because I grew up in a house where yelling, screaming, cussing, calling names, trying to be a therapist and diagnose people, all those things were normal in my house growing up. My mom did those things to me. And so that became habitual for me. It was a generational pattern that was passed down to me. And I had to learn how to take those things off. And it's still, I'm in that refinement process of making sure those things don't continue to be habitual for me. So I don't say that with shame. I just say that we want to stay away from diagnosing or bashing character, and we want to just describe what the issue is. So instead of saying, you're an a-hole and you're selfish and you're narcissistic, you could just say, I feel unheard by you, right? Using that I statement. I noticed that when I had this conversation, I tried to have this conversation with you, you walked away while I was in the middle of talking. Or, that sort of thing. Where you're you're detailedly explaining what the behavior was and how that made you feel, and doing that in a gentle way. We want to watch our tone and our facial expression and our body language while we're doing that. And so a great way to just do this, in my opinion, is to take a deep breath before you even let it come out of your mouth. Or if you forget, do that in the middle of the sentence, pause. And then continue and reset yourself. So sometimes I will start talking and I will not realize when I start talking that I'm very tense. And so my body's tense, my body language is tense, my face gets an angry tension to it kind of sometimes. And then I will notice it going into my tone and all that in the middle of whatever conversation or sentence I'm trying to get out. And then I will reset. I'll be okay, well, I started crappy, but okay, it's fine. We can reset. And I'll take a deep breath and I'll say, I'm sorry, I just raised my voice or my tone changed. What I'm trying to say is, and then I'll restart. And as soon as I apologize and I just correct it, I can notice my husband softening to whatever I'm about to say. And that's the thing is you're never too far. You can always apologize and recorrect how you need to address something, how you need to communicate. So don't feel if you fail once or if you start and you mess up that, it's just doomed, because it's not. Progress can be made. Progress over perfection. So okay, and then the third, and I had Ephesians 4:29 as a verse listed there to look over. I don't remember what it was off the top of my head, but go and jot that down and go look at it. Okay, and then the third point is to stay specific. So that means we want to discuss one issue at a time. We already discussed how you want to detailedly describe it, so there's that specific, but there's also the specific where our husbands don't do so well when we're jumping around the spider web of thoughts that we have. Now, I do know that sometimes as women, we do better with this with other women, and men tend to not do as well with it. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about like the rabbit trails. You know, like when you're trying to have a conversation and it starts with one clear point where you're like talking about this one thing, but then that reminds you of something else and you trail off, and then there's like 20 side trails, and then you may or may not remember to get back to the one thing that you were trying to get to at the end of the road originally, right? And so I say that because I know from my husband and from hearing the jokes on the internet that other people are struggling with this too. So try to discuss one thing at a time. If that is your topic, stay on that topic. And if you find yourself trailing off, then jot it. Have a sticky note or your phone notes, or sometimes I'll like text my husband or text myself. Like I will literally text myself things, whether that's on iMessage or Voxer, like just so I remember. Like just to note things down. So if you need to note things down because you feel like you're gonna get sidetracked, then do. You can have a sticky note right on your hand in front of you that says like, this is the topic, like finances, or even more specific than that. Maybe it's like, you know, joint account, something like that, like super specific what you're discussing, and then just have it on your hand. Like, okay, I'm trailing off, let's get back. And then if there is something that feels pressing to you that you're like, oh my gosh, I need to get this out in the moment, then you can just catch yourself, say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm trailing off, let me just jot this down real fast so that I don't forget to come back to this later, write it down, then get back on topic. And obviously, like, this is kind of a side note as I'm talking about, not side trailing, but real quick, if you struggle with this regularly, or you struggle with brain fog, you struggle with remembering things, then I would look to the health side of things, because that sounds more health related. And those are all like health related issues. When you're having a lot of brain fog and you're having confusion, or you like struggle to stay on topic, those sort of things are usually related to something that's going on. And you know, I'm not a health coach, but I've done a lot of research for myself, so that's just a note. I'm not a doctor, but go look into that for yourself if that's something you're struggling with. Okay, and then moving on to our third point here. We're moving on to the next point. Okay, so practice respectful boundaries, not silent resentment. So if boundaries need to be there, then we want to make sure that boundaries don't turn into silence. Now, you'll notice if you've been in my groups, on my email list, listening to my podcast, you'll probably notice that I don't really talk about boundaries a lot. And that is because boundaries, in a lot of ways, and most of the time, are very counteractive to connection. Like, it's very hard to have a deeper connection when you're putting boundaries up. I like to feel like my marriage is the one place I don't have to have a whole lot of boundaries, right? Like, obviously you could call our base level expectations boundaries, but I wouldn't use that word. So I guess that just kind of depends on what your definition of boundaries in a marriage is. For me, I just don't like to use that word because it feels really restrictive, and it feels like we're putting a wall up in some way. And I like to feel like I can discuss whatever I need to with my husband, but there does need to be boundaries in the sense that, like, we know what we can or cannot say to each other, how we can or cannot say it, what is appropriate behavior in marriage and what is not, those sorts of things. But again, boundaries with grace always. And then we really want to avoid going into like the silent bitterness, or like shutting down, both people shutting down. That is very unproductive as well. So 3 points to this. 1, express your needs clearly. We've already said this a lot, but I just want to say it again. Like, make it very clear. For example, I need us to make a plan for finances together so that I don't feel alone carrying it, or so that I feel like we're on the same page, we're connected, it's our money, right? Like, when you're in a marriage, it shouldn't be your money and your money, it's our money, right? And so I just keep coming back to that example because that's such a common one that people struggle with, and we've struggled with it. And then number 2 is allow space without punishment. And so this means that if tensions rise or someone gets overwhelmed, it's okay to tap out, like to take a pause. And you should have a plan for this. I mean, if you've never discussed this in your marriage, now's the time. Now's the time to discuss what your plan for pausing is without punishing each other, without getting angry about it. Because when I started implementing this, it was like marriage changing, actually. Like, that sounds traumatic, but it really was, because I felt like, and this is typical, okay? This is actually very typical for women and men to struggle with this, but I felt like if we walked away from the conversation, it was never going to be resolved. We need to deal with it right then. Like, the thought of him walking away to take a second, or me walking away to take a second, like, that gave me anxiety. I'm like, no, it needs to be handled right now, right here. Okay, so the thought of walking away, it just gave me so much anxiety. I'm like, no, that we have to handle this right now, or it'll never get resolved. Like, I don't know if that's why I thought that, but anyways. And my husband was the opposite. He was like, no, I don't want this to escalate. I don't want us to hurt each other. I don't want this to turn into a full-blown fight. So I need to walk away. Like, that was his attitude about it. And I viewed that as like apathetic, or like he's trying to run away, or, and so it frustrated me and it frustrated him, because he's like, don't you understand? I'm trying to protect you. I'm trying to protect us by me taking a second. And when I say protect, I don't really mean like physically, like, we've never had a very physically violent relationship, but more like explosive anger and words and things like that. And so, he had good intentions, but I couldn't see it, and he couldn't see what I was seeing. It was like we were both in our anxiety or our worry or our struggle internally, but we had completely different lenses on, right? Like, he's seeing it through the blue lenses, I'm seeing it through the pink lenses. And so I say all that to say that have a plan in place, in set time frames. Like, we're going to walk away for 10 minutes, then we'll come back together for 10 minutes, or we're going to walk away. 1 second. Okay, sorry about that. Toddler interruptions again. Okay, back to what I was saying. So it's okay to have that structured time apart, take a breath, both pray, get back into a place where you feel like you've collected your thoughts, because honestly, that's really hard to do for most people when they're in the middle of a conversation. They're standing across from someone. Tensions can rise, emotions can rise, and then it's so hard to think clearly. But if you have that moment to step apart, that's amazing. That's so amazing, because why is it amazing? One, because you get to collect your thoughts, but even more than that, if you've been to my Path to Communicate training, or listened to my emotional processing podcast episode, then you know the tool, right? The PATH method to how to process your emotion. And if you have the path to processing your emotion, the 4 steps, this is the perfect time to work on it. You take that moment apart, you process those emotions, and then you can collect your thought. So you're like, okay, we're apart for 10 minutes. Maybe you process your emotion for 2 minutes, then you collect your thoughts for another 3 minutes maybe, and then you pray for 5 minutes. Like, it could look different than that, but that's just an example. And then you're able to come back together, and you have a clear mind, you've resetted your heart posture, and you're ready to continue the conversation. So a good way to do this is like, okay, we're going to break for 10 minutes, come back together for 10 minutes. Or we're going to break for 15 minutes, come back together for 15 minutes. Or it could be different. It could be, we're going to break for 15 and we're going to come back for 10, right? Like, something like that. Whatever you guys agree to, the key is just you both want to agree. So sometimes you will have to compromise on this. Maybe your husband doesn't want to talk about it as long as you do, and so maybe he wants to break for 15 and only come back for 10, and you want to break for 10 and come back for 15. Okay, well then, I don't know, maybe you break for 12 and talk for 12. I don't know, but you find a compromise. Okay, and then the third point here is to protect honor. And this means that some of those boundaries you put in place, right, they're going to be no yelling, no name calling, no public shaming. In fact, I make it a point to not try to say, okay, I might have slipped up on this once or twice in our married life, but I'm not going to claim to be perfect, but I will say that I have been very intentional about making sure that I do not shame him or say anything negative about him or use any negative words, language about him in front of other people, because whether he's there or not, just because I feel this strong conviction to protect his honor and to speak well of him, I feel like that's my job as his wife. And so this is different if you have like one friend that you're like really being vulnerable with and sharing with and getting wise counsel with, right? Like that's different. We should get wise counsel. We should have someone praying with us and praying for us and even giving us wisdom and advice and like helping us get through those hard moments. But that's not the same as like you're in front of a group of people or you're hanging out with friends or you're at an event and like all the girls are complaining about their husbands and you join in, or one girl says something about her husband, you're like, oh yeah, my husband always does that too, or like that is not healthy. And it's also not healthy like when you're with your husband in a group and maybe someone else starts picking fun of him and you join in, or someone else is like fishing. I think sometimes people fish whether they realize that's what they're doing or not. They might just think they're trying to have a conversation, but it comes across as fishing and they're like trying to get you to say something and you're tempted to say something negative, but you don't. Like, right, we pause and we're like, So that's kind of like the theme there. It's like no yelling, no name calling, no public shaming. And those are the three main basic things. You guys could have ones that you discuss and create other than that. And so, for example, if like apathy is very apparent in your relationship, this is usually a struggle more for men than women. And it's very common. I just want to say, like, if your husband's struggling with this and he's coming across very apathetic, doesn't want to talk about things as much as you, or if ever, doesn't want to have deep conversations, doesn't want to spend doesn't want to spend the same amount of like quality time in the same way as you. And I'm sorry if this is being like a little generic. I'm trying to think of good examples, but there's nothing coming to mind right now. But if your husband is a little more distant and you feel like you're struggling to connect because of his distance, right? Or maybe he was distant and then you became distant out of like trying to protect yourself and your own heart, whatever that looks like. If that is an issue, then that could even be a boundary in your marriage as well, of like, okay, well, we are not going to give each other the silent treatment. That just will not be acceptable in this relationship. And we need to put things in place if we're going to put boundaries. So if someone is tempted to do this, this is what they should do. Maybe that's go spend 5 minutes praying to the Lord or reading a certain scripture and letting their heart be convicted about it, or go talk to a godly mentor, like whatever, and then we'll come back together. Or if they still refuse, then this is what's going to happen. Like, we're going to get a mentor involved or the pastor involved, like whatever it is. If that's a common issue, then we need to put some sort of barrier in place, like this isn't okay, this isn't biblical, we have the scripture to back it up, we should not be acting this way. Now how are we going to make sure it doesn't? And what's going to happen what should you do if you feel tempted to fall into that behavior again? And what should we do if you do fall into that behavior again? And that could go on either end, right? Like, so this needs to be when we're having these conversations, we really need to have these things in place. And that's like a whole separate conversation, right? Like, it's almost like you need to have a conversation about how we're going to communicate, right? And so that might be the first step before you even have the hard conversation, is having a conversation about communicating more and communicating better. So hopefully this is making sense. Drop any questions you have below. I will come back and answer them. Okay, listen to understand even when you disagree. This is point 4. So understanding is not agreement always. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. But it is just acting with love, with grace, with compassion, right? And so 3 points to this. 1, reflect before responding. So, for example, you might say, so you're worried I don't trust you with money. Did I hear that right? So you're kind of going to reflect back to them what they said to you and confirm if that's correct or not. And you might say things like, okay, it sounds like you're trying to say blank, blank, blank. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Is that accurate? Like that sort of thing. And just giving them room. And then once they say that, you can even say, okay, can you tell me more about that? Why do you feel that way? What else is coming up for you? That sort of thing. Like really giving them room to talk. And what's the word I'm looking for? That might feel overly vulnerable for them. And that's okay. Like if they don't want to keep talking, especially if this is new, right? Then like it's okay. You can pull back a little bit and know that again we're making progress. We don't need to get to perfection overnight. Obviously, if this is happening, over multiple conversations over years, then we might want to start to, push a little more. Like sometimes my husband will try to say I don't know to me, and I'm like, you know better than to say I don't know to me at this point. Like we have been, using these coaching tools with each other. And he knows when I ask him questions that I know if he thinks about it, he'll find an answer. So sometimes I will push him a little bit. I'll be like, you do know. And then I'll ask the question again. And I try not to like get an attitude about it or anything. Sometimes like, I like that what my voice just did. Like, you do know. Like that's not my normal conversation voice, but I wouldn't really say it's like an attitude either. It's more like, oh, don't be silly. Come on, tell me. Like, you do know. I know you know. And so I think those little things are okay. It's just, really in the end, what works for me and my husband might not work for you and your husband if, different things trigger you. Like, if your husband's triggered by the voice that I just made, then that wouldn't be a good solution for you. So we have to get to the root of those things. Like, what's triggering you? Why is it triggering you? Is there some healing work that needs to be done there? And how can we each like work on ourselves, right? Because it's really about focusing on yourself and your relationship to the Lord, and then letting that overflow into your marriage. Okay, so the second point is to validate emotion, not action. So to say like, I can see why that frustrated you. And this is, okay, let me just say this. This point, listen to understand even when you disagree, is mostly about when you disagree. So like, when I say validate emotion, not action, if they did a good action, you can validate that. Like, I'm not saying not to ever. I'm saying if they did something that you didn't love, that you didn't necessarily agree with, or they said something that you don't necessarily agree with, you can still be respectful, right, without fully agreeing with them. So you can validate the emotion or what they're, like, the heart posture behind it. You could say, like, I can see why that frustrated you, or I can see why you feel that way, or I can kind of see why you would think that. I don't fully agree with you, but I do see part of your point. Or maybe, and we don't want to say that if we haven't asked them to tell us more about it, right? We don't want to jump to that conclusion. And that's why we start with reflecting and saying, like, tell me more and all that, so we know that we can actually respond in the right, proper way, a way that is going to be a blessing to them and to your relationship, and not just a gut reflex based off of, whatever they said. I don't remember exactly where I was, but we want to make sure that we can actually say we don't agree with it and know that confidently, and not mishear something, or only get half the context and then respond before we really know what they're saying. And also, the more you listen, the more you'll hear them get to process through their thoughts, and you'll have deeper understanding, and so will they. And then that just makes it so much easier. It also allows you to see the good in whatever they're sharing, because there usually is at least a speck of good in there somewhere, or they're gonna, like, usually we naturally try to defend ourselves a little bit, or like sprinkle in what the good aspect of it was. It just always usually naturally happens. So just be listening for that, and be ready to mention it, to validate it back to them, so that whatever disagreement you need to bring up, they'll hear the positive thing as well. And then the third point here is to ask clarifying questions. We've kind of touched on this, but again, saying things like, help me understand how you're feeling this, how you're feeling about this, why you're feeling this way, what makes you say this, can you tell me more about that? those sorts of things, so that they're hearing that instead of what you're really thinking, which is probably like, why don't you care, blank, why don't you care about me, why don't you care that I'm feeling this way, why, or even just statements like, you don't care, or I'm alone in this, those sorts of things. So just asking to understand and listening to understand and repeat back and reflect and really be a mirror for them in that moment. So that'll help both of you, I promise. I promise it will. And then when it's your turn to talk, then you can say that with clarity. And if you guys, this was not in here at all, but this could even be part of the boundaries section of this. I just thought of it off the top of my head. Is like, if you guys have a problem talking over each other when you get into passionate conversations, then you might need to put a boundary in place for that. Like, we're not going to talk over each other, and maybe you need to pass a talking stick. I don't know, like, that might sound a little childish, but it's like, sometimes we just need that physical thing to remind us, like, oh, right, I don't have the stick, it's not my turn. And then it's also like a permission to speak, because you have to pass it. So it's like, okay, you have permission to speak now. It just makes things like really more open. They're going to be more open to hearing you if they're like handing you this talking stick and they're like giving you permission to say something to them. So that could be a solution. I've never personally tried it, but I just thought of it and I was like, that could be a really good idea for someone, and your husband may or may not be open to that. But if you're going to bring it up to him, I would use all of these tools. And if you haven't heard my Path to Communicate training, then just be on the lookout for the next time I do that, because that one really goes into depth on just like general communication and emotional processing tools that are really great across the board for any conversation you need to have. And if you have questions about how to customize these things to maybe a certain situation or to you and your spouse below, drop those and I would love to answer them. Okay, now, let me find my spot back. Okay, we're moving on to point 5. This is our last point, and we have 3 sub-points to this one, just like the other ones. So anchor the conversation in hope, not hopelessness. This is the 5th point, because even hard topics should lean more towards unity and not towards like despair and hopelessness and fear, right? We don't want to make decisions or act out of fear or all these other things. So 1 is to affirm commitment. This is something that like just can reassure you and your spouse. Even if you're in a conversation where you're struggling, sometimes you need to say things like, I am not here to be against you. I'm here for us to find a solution together. Or I want us to grow closer through this, not drift apart. Or, I want us to understand where each other's coming from so we can have greater compassion and empathy and love for each other. That sort of thing. Or it could be just as simple as like, me being upset about this thing does not mean that I want our relationship to end, or that, I look illy upon you, or that I don't respect you. It doesn't mean any of those things. It just means that I am struggling with this and I need your help so that we can handle this together, because we are supposed to be a team, right? And that kind of leads into the 2nd point here, which is to invite that partnership, that teamwork, and say, how can we work together on this? Like, do you have any ideas, right? Like, do you have any ideas about how we could solve this together? What ways could we, refine what we're currently doing to make this more of a teamwork situation? So we want to make it more like set the tone and, put little positive reframes in there to remind both of you that, like, hey, we're a team. We're not at war. This is not, you and me against each other. And if you're angry, if you're feeling frustrated and you need an enemy, then pick the enemy, the Satan, like, right? Like, if you're going to war against somebody, let it be against him and not him creating division between you two. So sometimes we need to say those things, and we need to think those things so that we can have that mental reminder that, hey, we're a team, we're not against each other, we do have an enemy, but it's not us, it's him. Okay. And then the last thing here is to speak life. So remember that there's the power of life or death on the tongue. What you say matters. And so sometimes we want to say things that our mind might not think are true yet, but wants to be true. So for example, if your husband's really struggling in an area, or say for example your husband struggles with anger, and you're trying to have a conversation with him and he gets angry, you could say, hey honey, it's not like you to get so angry and worked up. Are you okay? Like, is something going on? Is there something I can do to help you? And one, this is biblical, because what does the Bible say? It says, a gentle answer turns away wrath. And so that's a superpower that you have. The Bible has so much practical wisdom in it. Go and find it. I love Proverbs. It's so good. You'll find that in Proverbs, by the way. I don't remember exactly which verse, but I can find it and drop it below. It's so good. So that's just an example of speaking life over your husband, and to say, like, you and him might both be thinking in that moment, like, what do you mean that's not like me? That's totally like him or whatever to do that, right? But you can choose to speak that over him, to say, that's not like you, right? Because we don't want anger to become a personality trait for him, but he might have already taken that on, and that's part of why he's so angry. Because he's let anger become part of his personality, but that's not who he is. He is a child made in the image of God, right? And so, it all goes back to who we see ourselves as and who we see God as, because we're made in God's image. It all goes back to that, but that's a separate conversation for a different day. I'll save that for our Fruits of the Spirit training, so just stay tuned for that. But yeah, okay, so to wrap this up, just declare faith over your marriage, even if your husband doesn't, even if you both are struggling to believe it. Continue to speak life over your marriage. Believe that there's hope. Believe that God can step into any situation and heal it, and begin taking the steps. Don't just believe it and stop there. Begin to take the steps in faith that God is calling you to. So even if you don't see things changing, start to be the change in the positive direction. Start to work on you, even if you don't see your husband changing. Start to move towards God and pray for your husband, pray for your marriage, pray for your kids. Start to let that overflow and that peace and that joy from the Lord pour out of you into your home. All right, just a final reminder before we get off. You are not responsible for your husband's responses, but you are responsible for how you show up, how you posture yourself, your heart positioning, and your message that you let come out of your mouth. So speak in courage and in truth. Use humility in your tone, and show up with a heart that God can, that honors God. And use, all the tools that God's given you to bless your husband and to honor God with your marriage and your husband. So continue stewarding all that you have well. I believe in you, and I'm here if you have any questions or prayer requests, drop them below. Hope you have a blessed day.